Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us at the Fort Worth Public Library on this breezy afternoon. Before we get started, I would like to tell you that at the back of the room we have brochures for the World War I series. We've got a lecture series as well as a movie series. Also some information about the current exhibit in this brochure. The exhibit will be up through February the 23rd. And also I wanted to mention that on Tuesday, December the 4th at 7 p.m. in this same room, Bobby Wygant, who was Channel 5's arts and entertainment reporter for many, many years, will be discussing her memoir, Talking to the Stars, Bobby Wygant's 70 Years in Television. So again, that's at 7 p.m. on Tuesday, December the 4th. And now I would like to introduce to you Jim Hodgson of the Fort Worth Aviation Museum.
Thanks, Linda. Thank you. Again, thank you for being here for the first of 7 lectures as part of the second World War I exhibition. This one, if you've had a chance already, is entitled Remember Me. It's a lot of personal stories about not just military people and veterans, but also the civilians who were here in Fort Worth during the time, and talks about the whole transformation of Fort Worth and North Texas during the war years. When you consider that over a 4-year period of time, nearly $67 billion in today's dollars went into the economy here in North Texas. That's the equivalent of the entire F-35 program at Lockheed now, which has been going on for nearly 20 years. So it was a huge impact on the area, and I'm glad to say that we've got Justin and Amber today, who have been involved with us from the first exhibit and the second one, and are going to tell you a little bit about the industry labor and the end of the First World War. So, Justin.
That's okay.
Something else. Oh, we'll just leave it up here, I guess.
All right.
Oops, I'll take it back.
All right. Well, hello, and thank you very much for coming today. I do greatly appreciate it. Amber and I have been working very hard on the exhibit for the past couple years, and we're happy to finally see it come to fruition and to be here today to speak to y'all. Today we're going to discuss some of the social aspects of the First World War and its immediate aftermath. The focus of this lecture is going to really look at the industries of North Texas and the labor that is associated with those industries. North Texas industries did play a vital role in the United States war effort during the First World War. And can everybody hear me okay, or do I need to? Yes? Okay. I'm not comfortable with using microphones, I'm sorry. I spend all of my time lecturing, and so I think I project my voice pretty well. North Texas industries did play a vital role in the United States war effort during the First World War. The Texas industries, such as cotton, coal, oil, and even the railroads, were very important to ensure that the United States had the capability to wage war against the Central Powers in Europe. So the focus of this second exhibit has been on the individuals in the region that have contributed to the war effort to some capacity. Okay, so when discussing industry in North Texas, one man stands out, and that is William Knox Gordon. So, my thing's not working. Uh-oh. Am I out of range?
Don't know. I can give you a different...
Okay, so pause that. Oh, there it went. Or you did that. Technology, if anything, it's reliable, right? Yeah. There we go. All right. So where was I? Oh, yes. So this exhibit has focused on individuals. And so as such, whenever you're going to talk about industry in North Texas, William Knox Gordon is a man who definitely stands out. So Gordon he was a predominant industrial leader in North Texas in the early part of the 20th century. Gordon was easily able to rally support from other energy companies in the region. And this is going to be important as it ensured that Texas could actually meet the quotas that the federal government was needing, especially in regards to coal and oil, to continue the war and to be able to fight the war efficiently. Now, William Knox Gordon was born in Virginia on January 26th of 1862, and Gordon's many occupations included a self-made railroad surveyor, a mine manager, and an independent oil and gas producer. Gordon, he had originally moved to Texas in 1889 up to the North Texas region, and what he was there for was he was going to survey a route for the railroad between Dublin and Thurber, Texas, so heading out towards West Texas, for the Texas and Pacific Railroad. That was going to become one of the transcontinental railroads that passes through Texas. While surveying around Thurber, however, Gordon met Robert Dickey Hunter, who at the time was the president of the Texas and Pacific Coal Company. The Texas and Pacific Coal Company was created specifically to get coal for the Texas and Pacific Railroad. And the two companies are not the same entity. They were two separate companies altogether, but Hunter had chose the name of the railway to try to secure a contract. And so Hunter was actually very impressed with Gordon and offered him a position as a civil and mining engineer at the Thurber mining operations, the mining camp there at Thurber. Gordon actually excelled at his work and successfully managed the mine and also patented several significant technological advancements or innovations that helped the mining industry during this period. One of those inventions, of course, was the dreaded screen, which was the bane of all miners. The screen was a device, because miners are paid by the ton, right? And so the device would actually shake out the pea coal and nut coal, and the miners would not get paid for the pea coal. They would only get paid for the nut coal. And so they were losing a lot of money. So that is an innovation that became the standard for the American coal industry that was pioneered here in North Texas thanks to Gordon. In 1899, Gordon did become the vice president of the company and manager of the Thurber mines. Gordon, however, wanted to expand the Texas and Pacific Coal Company's enterprise into oil production. Gordon kind of had his ear to the ground and saw that the next big industry in Texas was oil, and that coal was definitely going to be coming to an end. So Gordon had attempted several national and international endeavors. Going through his papers, I had seen where he had attempted to find oil in Argentina, Florida, Arkansas, places like that. So he was heavily involved in trying to find oil in other parts of the world. In 1915, though, just prior to the U.S. entry into the Great War, Gordon thought that there could possibly actually be oil deposits just a few miles from Thurber. It was like right under his nose the whole time, right? And he had no idea. And so he does get close to what's now Strawn, Texas. He does get the support that he needs from the company to mine for oil in that region, or to drill for oil. And he's successful. A little bit of oil is found in 1915 close to Strawn, Texas. That gives Gordon the leverage that he needs to continue more exploratory oil enterprises in the region. And so 2 years later, Gordon discovers the vast Ranger oil fields, which were much more productive than the Strawn fields. The Ranger fields are going to be one of the major oil fields in oil production in North Texas. And it really gave a boom to the region's economy forever, changed it and transformed it. So after the oil boom at Ranger, Gordon had actually changed the Texas Pacific Coal Company's name to the Texas and Pacific Coal and Oil Company. Oil is going to play a major part in the company from here on out. And so because of this, Gordon successfully led the company into being an industrial powerhouse in the region. Instead of only focusing on coal production, they're also going to focus on oil production. And that's going to be very important because the Ranger fields are discovered in 1917, just prior to U.S. entry into the war. The Ranger fields are going to be instrumental in making sure that Texas is providing enough oil for the U.S. war machine. And so when discussing William Knox Gordon, he was definitely a captain of industry in regards to the North Texas economy. He was involved in all major industries to a certain degree in the region, including the railroad, because obviously the railroad was relying heavily on the coal And then the railroad was used to transport coal and oil and all such like that. But even cotton, the Texas Pacific Mercantile Company had actually gotten involved in the cotton industry as well. They had their own cotton gin and own cotton processing facilities there in Thurber. So all major Texas industries of North Texas, Gordon played a hand in to one degree or another. And so now I'm going to discuss the various industries that were here in North Texas. And so we'll start with the cotton industry. And this is going to be kind of a history of cotton in Texas and then its contribution to the war effort. So the cotton industry is perhaps the first major industry in Texas. The cotton industry was for sure the first major cash crop in Texas. And cotton production actually started in the 18th century, the mid-18th century, around San Antonio de Bejar, just modern San Antonio. And that's where the Spanish, who was under Spanish control at this time obviously, started producing the crop. And so the thing to keep in mind with cotton during the 18th century, now cotton is a cheap fabric, right? It's something that everything's made out of cotton. But it was so labor intensive early on that pretty much cotton was only reserved for the wealthiest folks. Only the rich people wore cotton, while your poor folks were the ones that wore like linen and stuff like that. And so it does kind of make sense that cotton production in Texas would start around what was essentially the political capital of the Texas colony for the Spanish during the Spanish colonial period. Now, when Anglos started to come from the United States in the 1830s, the 1820s and then the 1830s, they brought that agrarian culture, that agrarian cotton culture with them to Texas and made cotton an exportable crop that we think of whenever we do think of the antebellum South and the post-Civil War period. And because we do start to see the mass production of cotton. And so in the pre-Civil War era, Texas was actually ranked 8th amongst the top 10 cotton-producing states in the nation. This rank actually increased as they continued to produce cotton all the way up into the 1860s. So Texas is a major player in regards to cotton exports. After the Civil War, the Texas economy, for the most part, was left intact. You didn't have Sherman's march to the sea through Texas, right? You didn't have Union soldiers subjugating the state during the war like you do in all the other southern states. And so, because of that, because the Texas economy is pretty much left intact, in the post-war period, Texas's cotton manufacturing is still on par as with the pre-war levels. And so in the post-war period, they're going to continue to produce cotton so that by 1900, the cotton crop in Texas yielded approximately 3.5 million bales from just over 7 million acres of land. So Texas is producing a lot of cotton leading into the 20th century. And so, U.S. entry into the European conflict, or the Great War, created a massive spike in the demand for cotton. Cotton was needed in great supply for the war effort, and so as a result, it created a great sense of prosperity in North Texas, in the cotton fields, because the impoverished farmers who were usually in utter poverty were now in great demand, and they couldn't keep up with the demand of cotton, and so it was a very prosperous time for cotton farmers in the region, especially the poor guys who were trapped in the crop lien system or the sharecropping system that was definitely notorious in Texas in the post-Reconstruction period. And so cotton was used to make uniforms, web gear, tents, and everything else that utilized cotton canvas. The U.S. Army uses a lot of cotton canvas, right? And so cotton was in high demand in order to clothe and equip U.S. soldiers who were going to Europe to fight. And so Texas farmers and landowners were eager to answer the call and supply the cotton that was desperately needed for the war effort. Another major industry in Texas that I want to focus on, and perhaps one of the most fascinating as far as I'm concerned, is the coal industry. Usually whenever you think of Texas, you don't necessarily think of coal, right? You're thinking more like Pennsylvania, West Virginia, places like that. But another major industry that did play a vital role in the war effort was the coal industry in Texas. So following the Civil War, there were several efforts made to drastically expand the railroads in Texas. And of course, in order for railroad locomotives to operate, you have to have coal, right? They burn coal, and all such like that. That's their primary fuel. So the Texas railroads really needed a source for coal if they were going to operate in the state. And so the Texas Pacific Railroad Company first attempted to mine its own coal and alleviate the coal shortage, and established the first major coal mining operation in Texas. This is at Colville, which is real close to present-day Gordon, Texas. The Colville operation was, however, a very short-lived affair, and was soon replaced by the Johnson mines that were struck just a few miles away in the 1880s. The Johnson mines, however, had financial issues, and they weren't able to pay their debts or their miners. So the Knights of Labor had actually orchestrated a strike at the Johnson mines in protest of the lack of wages. So because of the labor and financial troubles the Johnson brothers are having, they're in a dire situation. And so Robert Dickey Hunter, seeing this situation, he offered to purchase the mines from the Johnson brothers. He said, okay, hey, cut your losses and I'll take over. And so the Johnson brothers agreed, and Robert Dickey Hunter did purchase both the mines and the strike. Hunter was successful in crushing the strike, and he utilized Texas Rangers to do so. You always hear the Pinkertons and folks like that crushed, labor strikes in the Northeast and places like that. Hunter utilized the Texas Rangers. The Texas Rangers were going to be instrumental in crushing this strike, and they used intimidation to scare off labor agitators, and they created the company town of Thurber. So Thurber became the largest mining operation in the state, and it grew drastically under the stewardship of William Knox Gordon after he had taken the company over after Hunter had retired. But due to the successes of the Thurber mines, there were several other mining operations that also kicked off in the state. Coal was mined extensively in Strawn, Lyra, Rock Creek, which is near present-day Mineral Wells, and Bridgeport. So the Texas coal industry wasn't limited to just one town or one area. It did stretch across North Texas. And by the early 20th century, coal was another major exportable product for Texas. In fact, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram boasted in 1903 that coal was king in Texas. People really thought that coal was going to be the major industry in Texas at this point in time. And so when the U.S. entered World War I, there was a great need for coal for the war effort. And so the Texas coal companies that were all led by William Gordon, their base of operations was here in Fort Worth. They met... all the company representatives would get together and meet and discuss a joint plan of action to plan to orchestrate coal production for the war effort. And so Gordon was the one that led this charge. And the Texas coal companies were able to increase coal production and actually meet the demands that the U.S. Armed Forces needed. Coal output increased drastically during the war years. And as such, wages were increased. The miners were actually paid a fair wage for their work during the war. And that was to keep the miners productive and happy. Reading Gordon's papers, he's talking about how go ahead and increase the wages of the miners because that way we won't have any labor troubles and we'll be able to meet our quotas. And so Gordon is successful in keeping the workforce happy, and he's going to continue to be able to increase coal production all across the state. And so the coal industry, as far as the coal industry is concerned, between the years of 1917 and 1918 were definitely the most peaceful or cordial years in Texas coal mine fields, right? Where there was high amount of work and high wages, right? So there was no need to go on strike, and the labor troubles were circumvented. So Gordon even boasted that miners all across Texas were happy to work in the mines as they felt like it was their part for the war effort. That they would gladly extend their hours to ensure that the U.S. government got the coal that it needed. So it's like the coal miners got behind the war effort and were more than happy to work longer hours. Of course, this was self-serving. The more hours you work, the more coal you're going to be able to mine, and so you're going to be able to increase your paycheck at the end of the month, right? So yeah, often forgotten is the Texas coal industry that did play a vital role. And the next industry I'll discuss is the oil industry. Of course, oil industry, whenever you think of Texas and oil go hand in hand, right? So another major North Texas industry that contributed greatly to the American war effort was indeed the oil industry. The oil industry is going to definitely transform the landscape of Texas as we still know it today, right? And much like the coal industry, the oil industry actually had a late start in Texas. Oil had already been being drilled for a few decades in Pennsylvania. But the oil gusher at Spindletop in 1901 definitely transformed the Texas economy forever. Prior to Spindletop, there were some exploratory wells that were drilled around Corsicana, but these sites yielded very little results. Spindletop, however, gushed, right, and it gushed with oil, and proved that there was a massive amount of oil that could actually be had in Texas. And so these early oil booms were restricted to the coastal areas of Texas for the most part. Spindletop and Corsicana and places like that. Beaumont is another one. They're in the coastal region. The North Texas oil booms did not occur until the mid-1910s, right before U.S. entry into the war. And it was actually William Knox Gordon who had pioneered these oil explorations in the region, right, that I'd already kind of discussed earlier. And as I'd said before, he was successful in his endeavors when his drilling crews had discovered the vast fields around Ranger. And so these discoveries coincided, though, with other discoveries across North Texas. Around the same time, places like Bridgeport, Breckenridge, Petrolia outside of Wichita Falls, Burke Burnett, and Electra also saw massive oil booms all across North Texas. And all of these booms placed North Texas at the center for oil production in the state. It is also worth noting that several innovations that became the standard for drilling oil actually originated in Texas. For example, the circulation mud was used for the first time in the Texas oil patches. Circulation mud is what makes it easier to drill through, like sandy earth and all such like that. Before, they were just using water and it was making a huge mess and it didn't work too well. So what they did with circulation mud was the first time they used it, and it was around Spindletop, they actually had cattle walk through and make this real murky mud, and then that was the first circulation mud that was ever used in the oil industry. And another innovation in Texas was the Christmas tree. Rightfully so, being December 1st, right, to talk about the Christmas tree, I guess. But the Christmas tree is a device that made it safe to cap an oil or gas well. It's this valve system where it has several valves where you could slowly but surely close off the pressure and not have to worry about the well blowing or anything like that. And then the roller core bit that revolutionized oil drilling in Texas, and not only in Texas but the broader United States, was also another innovation that originated here in Texas, which was a new type of bit that made it possible to break through the super rocky terrain and get through that hard Texas crust. So the discovery of the vast North Texas oil fields, though, came at a very opportune time for the Texas economy. These discoveries had occurred just prior to the outbreak of the First World War. And so the United States needed vast amounts of oil in order to fuel its war machine. And because of the volume of oil that was actually being produced in Texas, the Texas oil companies were actually able to provide. So it's one of those things that if oil had been discovered maybe 1918, I don't know if the Texas oil companies would have been as successful because they wouldn't have gotten that initial kick from the federal government and all those contracts, right, here in North Texas. So it's really because of timing coupled with the volume of oil that oil became the number one industry in Texas in North Texas in the late 19-teens, and definitely remains the number one industry in Texas to this day, as millions of Texans still work and provide for their families in and around the oil patch. So the oil industry is definitely a major industry that we still contend with today and rely heavily on as a state. Our state economy thrives on it. So the railroad industry is the final industry that I'm really going to discuss or talk about. And the railroad industry is important because not a single one of these vital North Texas industries would be able to contribute to the war effort if it wasn't for the railroads in the state, right? In the 1910s, the only viable method for transporting large amounts of goods was via the railroad, right? And it's still that way today. You go out there around Saginaw, and you can see how coal and oil is still being transported along the railroad to this day. And so these Texas industries, if they're going to be able to contribute to the war effort, they're all going to have to make it to market. And fortunately, the Texas railroads were actually well established at this point in time and thriving by the time the U.S. entered the war, and so they were able to provide. And it is interesting because Texas was kind of late in the game on the railroads as well. In fact, the Republic of Texas, on one of its currencies, I don't remember which bill it was, it has a picture of a railroad, like of a locomotive. But there were no locomotives in Texas when that was printed. And so it's kind of like a dream trying to show the Republic of Texas as being something that it wasn't. And railroads aren't really going to become as prominent in Texas until that post-Civil War period. You're going to have a few, of course, but nothing like the number that you're going to have in the post-war period. But anyway, so between 1880 and 1890, like for example, prior to the 1880s, there were only about 2,000 miles of railroad track in Texas. However, during the 1880s, you do have several private companies that had gotten involved in the railroad industry in Texas, and they started to develop railroad tracks. So it's the private sector that is going to develop railroads in Texas. And so between 1880 and 1890, an additional 4,000 miles of railroad track had actually been laid. And there were actually 2 transcontinental railroads that crossed through Texas. The one was the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio line, and the other was, of course, the Texas and Pacific line. Right? Those are the two transcontinental railroads in Texas. By 1911, Texas became the state with the most railroad mileage in the nation. So Texas, from the 1880s to 1911, in a very short period of time, Texas quickly surpassed the rest of the nation. Having more railroad mileage than all the other states is impressive, but I think a lot of that's contributed to our size, right? Being a large state that it is. And so the reason, for this increase in railroad mileage, though, during this period is because, farmers and mining companies and oil companies all needed a way to transport their goods to market. So as we move from 1900 to 1910, these private companies are the ones that are encouraging expansion of the railroads. And because of this necessity, the railroads to transport coal and oil, Gordon did maintain a very close working relationship with the railroad companies in North Texas. So during the First World War, the railroad system in Texas had become a vital component of the war effort. Not only was the railroad relied heavily upon to bring the much-needed cotton, coal, and oil out of the state and across the country, but the railroad also served as a transportation method, right? So the railroad was heavily utilized to transport thousands of troops and supplies across the state to and from the training locations. One great example is here in Fort Worth, right? Camp Bowie, which was located along what's now Camp Bowie Boulevard. Of course, it used to be Arlington Heights Boulevard. And so Camp Bowie was a major training ground for the U.S. Army. And the Army relied heavily on the railroad to bring new recruits to train them and then to ship them off to war. So once again, the Texas railroad industry is a vital component because it's bringing supplies that the U.S. government needs, but it's also transporting manpower that is also desperately needed to and from training locations and then sending them, quote unquote, over there. And so now, Amber here is going to discuss the end of the war and the social upheaval that followed.
So during the First World War, the railroad system in Texas had become a vital component for the war effort, like we were talking about, or like Justin talked about. So now we're going to move on to the very end of the war. Okay, the Great War ended on November 11th, 1918 at 11 a.m. Towards the end, over 10 million soldiers had died and another 10 million civilians had actually been killed due to disease and starvation. June 28th, 1919 brought an official end to the war with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles had a profound effect on the entire world and especially the United States during the year of 1919, which brought unprecedented turmoil within the economy. With the end of the war, the prosperous wartime economy that the country had enjoyed for the past 2 years came to an abrupt end. The demand for coal, cotton, steel, finished textiles, and other industrial goods disappeared virtually overnight. Instantly, the nation experienced a sharp recession. As a direct result, the nation also experienced one of the greatest waves of labor unrest in American history. In 1919, more than 4 million workers went out on strike. Strikes occurred in all industries, including the telephone operators, steel workers, textile workers, miners, Broadway actors, and even some police departments went on strike, demanding higher wages. The greatest strike to take place in the United States occurred in Chicago at this time, when 365,000 steel workers went on strike, demanding union recognition, higher wages, as well as the 8-hour workday. After the war had ended, production went down, and so did pay. All of these miners' pays decreased, okay? As these companies tried to maintain their profits, typically it was the workers who would suffer. So their pay was decreased. So Texas was also involved in this national strike. When we think of strikers, we don't really think a lot about Texas. Many Texas industries went out on strike in 1919, which included the railroads and coal industries, and the oil companies were now concerned that the 24 Texas oil locations would follow suit and also go on strike, like they did in the Great Oilfield Strike of 1917, when 10,000 oilfield workers went out on strike. Again, we don't really think of oilfield workers striking. Today, oilfield workers don't typically strike. There's a plethora of reasons as to why oilfield men don't strike. One major reason, they get paid really well. Okay? They perform extremely dangerous, dirty jobs that other people don't want to perform, and they're paid very, very well for it. Okay? That's why oftentimes people say the oil field is a trap. It's a trap for young men that graduate high school and decide not to go to college or start businesses, things like that. They join the oil field because, $20, $30 an hour is a little too much money to give up, and they get trapped in it. Okay, it becomes this perpetual cycle for them. So not only did the railroads shut down in Texas, but so did the coal mines. Miners went on strike simultaneously in Thurber, Strawn, and Bridgeport, Texas. This created a major coal crisis in the region, and newspaper reports stated that the coal situation would probably get worse before it got better. And it did. The reason why the coal miners in Texas went on strike is because their wages had been cut after the war ended, like I said before, and the coal companies decided to slash workers' wages to the pre-war scale. Okay? At the same time, the companies did not lower the miners' cost of living. So they were living in these company towns. All the money they were making was going back into company stores. It was going back into company homes, because they all lived in these oftentimes fenced-in company towns. Okay, they paid rent to the elites who owned the companies. Okay, rents were going up and wages were going down. Okay, there was a massive discrepancy between the cost of living and the wages at this time. So that caused a huge upheaval. Texas involvement in this national labor movement shouldn't come as a surprise. Today, Texas has a reputation of actually being hostile towards unions. Prior to 1920, however, Texas workers were heavily involved in the national labor movement. The best example of Texas's involvement in the national labor movement can best be seen in the coal industry. When the Knights of Labor attempted their national strike in the 1880s, the Texas coal mines were involved. When the when the radical industry workers of the world united and orchestrated their 1907 strike, the Texas coal industry was involved. This is a trend that does repeat itself through the 1910s and after the First World War. In fact, it's also worth noting that Texas farmers had led a radical labor campaign called the Farmers Alliance. Many farmers were faced with losing their farms, and they blamed the problems on the huge costs of the railroads, the high interest of the banks, as well as the economic policies of the federal government. The Farmers Alliance evolved into the National Populist Party, which sought to restore democracy and economic prosperity to the working class by introducing a graduated income tax, a system of low-cost public financing, and the right for workers to form unions. But perhaps the most controversial policy of the Populist Party was the push for public ownership of the railroads to ensure that farmers were able to get their crops to market on time and at a fair price. Obviously, that did not go over very well at all. It is clear that Texas was heavily involved and in some instances actually led the national labor movement from the 1870s through the 19-teens. The events in 1919, however, changed the political and economic landscape of Texas and also greatly affected the Texas labor movement. The oil industry following the First World War was not impacted like the cotton and coal industries. This is because the supply and demand for oil after the war did not diminish, since Texas oil companies produced the vast majority of the nation's oil. This had a profound effect on the Texas economy as oil started to replace the other two industries. After the war ended, the price of cotton plummeted to an all-time low. To make matters worse, the 1920s experienced another boll weevil outbreak that devastated the cotton crop in Texas. The 1920s also saw the transition of synthetic fabrics, which also had a profound effect on the cotton industry. The decrease in the value of cotton, the emergence of synthetic fibers, and the boll weevil epidemic resulted in many farmers and sharecroppers losing their farms as well as their jobs. In North Texas, many people who had been born and raised on the cotton patch left to go actually work in the oil field. Regions that used to be predominantly cotton become primarily oil field practically overnight. It's also interesting to note, for those of you who are well acclimated with oil field terminology, you may know that oftentimes new recruits or new hires are called worms. This is a term that describes new guys in the oil patch, which originated in Texas, and it's directly connected to the transition from the cotton patch to the oil field. In the 1910s and 1920s, new guys were called boll weevils because boll weevils had the reputation of being very destructive to cotton. Obviously, new hires sometimes didn't know what they were doing. I already talked about how dangerous and detailed these jobs are that they're performing, and so oftentimes training was not as rigorous as it probably should have been. And so oftentimes new hires would kind of destroy equipment, things like that. So in the 1930s and 40s, the term was actually shortened to just weevil to describe a new person. But by the 1950s, weevil had been replaced with worm, which is the term that is still used today for new hires within the oil field. The coal industry was also deeply impacted by the transition to oil. The coal industry was practically eradicated due to the success of oil. For example, the Texas and Pacific Coal and Oil Company that had reaped much higher profits from oil than coal. Another advantage was that the oil industry didn't have quite as severe labor troubles like coal. Finally, the company saved overhead from coal to oil, as the average oil rig only needed 2 to 5 people to operate. A mine shaft, on the other hand, needed at least 20 laborers inside. Okay, so not only were they making more money off of coal, but labor costs was down as well because they didn't need as many people. When the miners had gone on strike in Thurber in 1919, Gordon told the miners that they were no longer needed since the company had changed its focus primarily to oil. Now, he did take some of the miners. Okay, he did take some of them, like to Ranger and places like that. However, many of them were just left jobless there in Thurber, which is why that town went from a bustling 10,000 person town down to 3 today. It's still a town, but it has the population of 3 people. The same situation occurred in other areas as well, such as Bridgeport and Mineral Wells, as those regions are now known for its oil and gas production rather than its coal mining days. Many people today have absolutely no idea that Bridgeport and Mineral Wells actually began as coal mining towns and coal mining areas. As the 1910s came to a close and the 1920s began, oil rapidly became the new major industry of Texas that quickly surpassed previous Texas industries, and is still the primary industry of Texas that employs over 1.8 million people today. So now we're going to talk about the first Red Scare and the end of the radical labor movement in Texas. This is an extremely important time in Texas, okay? throughout history, we see two Red Scares. Okay, we have the first Red Scare and the second Red Scare. The first Red Scare oftentimes is overlooked because it did only last a year. It went from 1919 to 1920. The industrial shift from a more militant industries to oil was a major blow to labor movement in Texas. Gordon and other oilmen wanted to continue to surpass the labor movement and ensure that industrial unionism that was so prevalent in the coal mines did not expand as drastically into the oil fields. Luckily for Gordon and the Texas oil companies, a powerful weapon was now at their disposal, and that was the first Red Scare. The first Red Scare, which, like I said, occurred between 1919 and 1920, was very short-lived but very intense. The political intolerance of the international left was due to the Bolshevik Revolution that occurred in 1917, where you essentially have the Russian Revolution going from Russia to the Soviet Union, and you get a huge, massive rise of communism at this point in time. The success of a communist revolution in Russia made many people in the West, especially the United States, terrified that a similar revolution would take place here. As a result of this hysteria, Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, between November 1919 and January 1920, dispatched federal agents to raid up the offices of radical labor organizations throughout the country. The Palmer raids were overseen by a 24-year-old director of the Radical Division of the Justice Department named J. Edgar Hoover. More than 5,000 people were arrested during these raids, most of them without warrants and held for months without ever being charged. The government reported hundreds of immigrant radicals, and J. Edgar Hoover also began compiling files of thousands of Americans who were suspected of holding radical political ideas or practices. Labor unions, by and large, were associated with socialism, communism, anarchism, and as such were severely repressed by the federal government. As a result, labor radicals were forced underground. The IWW had essentially been destroyed, and even many moderates unions were in complete disarray as people left the union in droves as they didn't want to be associated as communist or red. Gordon and other oilmen were able to take advantage of the situation to ensure that the oil fields would become and remain union-free. In the early 1920s, when speaking to the people of Ranger, Gordon boasted that communists had arrived in Ranger and attempted to unionize the oil fields there. Gordon then stated that he was able to get rid of these communist agitators and destroy the threat of communism in Ranger by running them out of town, essentially. The reality, however, is that these agitators that Gordon was talking about were probably not actually communist. They were more likely union organizers attempting to unionize the Ranger fields. Due to the high tensions and rhetoric of the first Red Scare, Gordon was actually able to use the language of communism to turn popular sentiment against the unions. No one at this time wanted to be associated with communism or the Red Menace at all. And he played on this, Gordon did. He was a very intelligent man, even if he wasn't always fair. Out of the Red Scare, the Texas oil fields became completely deunionized. And oil field culture ever since that time has been staunchly anti-union, even up to today. Okay? Between the industrial shift to oil and the first Red Scare, the Texas radical labor movement was completely destroyed and was never able to resurface or recover like it did in other parts of the nation during the Great Depression. This is in large part due to the cultural shifts that occurred in the state during that pivotal period immediately following the First World War, and was a major watershed moment that helped to reshape the state as we know it today. So that concludes our presentation, and we thank you very much for coming out and listening. If any of you have any questions, Justin and I will be more than happy to answer them.
I have a question. What was the start of World War I?
What was the start of the First World War?
America and the World War.
Well, the First World War, the U.S. got involved because of the Zimmerman telegram. You have other things like the Lusitania and things like that, but Germany was corresponding with Mexico, which was in a state which was suffering a revolution at the time. And
What was the date?
She said when.
oh, the date? Oh shoot. 1917 is the year.
1914.
1917 for the U.S.
1914 is not available.
1914
Is when it
for, like,
started.
the European War.
But U.S. entry was 19. Oh, I don't think she cares.
Does anyone else have any questions?
When did Texas become a right-to-work state?
When it officially became a right to work state was the Hanley-Taft Act in the late 40s. Whenever you had a conservative resurgence with the rise of the Dixiecrats, that's whenever Texas officially becomes a right to work state.
In places that have unions, are all the employees obligated to pay into the union?
Yes.
Even though they may not want to?
It depends. Okay, so like Texas is a right to work state, right? So that means that if you're going to go work at Boeing, you don't have to be a member of the union. But if you go to other places, like especially in the Northeast where unionism runs rampant, then yeah, it's a closed shop, and in order to work there, you do have to be a member of the union and pay union dues and all such like that. But even then, like Boeing, even though you don't have to be a member of the union, if I understand correctly, the folks that work there, if you're not a paid member of the union, they kind of make it hard on you on the floor, the other employees, you know. But you're not actually obligated to.
There's a lot of unionization in areas that we don't even think about. Every time you hand your airplane ticket to a person at the desk, they're union. Your pilots are union, your flight attendants, your stewardess, they're all union, things like that, which, you know, it helps sometimes, you know, especially if a company goes under or something like that, then you're dispersed out to other union jobs, so that way you're not out of work. But
Yes.
It seems strange with the image of Texas having been that of a self-made man type of environment, that unionism was so readily adapted after, before even World War I.
Yeah.
What would be the cause for such a radical change in mentality?
probably
I think it's the oil field culture, because prior to World War I, whenever you see like the Farmers Alliance revolved heavily on solidarity. We're going to do this together. We're an alliance. And then the coal miners, they're standing in pact. But then whenever you get to the oil replacing these other industries, individualism becomes the mainstay. You have the freedom to, if you don't like what's happening at this rig, you'll just quit and go to another rig. You're not tied to those rig hands like you would be in a coal mine or your neighbor's farm and stuff like that. So I think it has a lot to do with the shift to oil and the individuality of oil culture.
And prior to that, you had a lot of immigrants working, and they band together. For example, in Thurber, it was a company town. However, every single section was divided by ethnicity. You had Poles, Italians, blacks, Czechs, Germans, and each nationality had their own area and their own place, and so they would band together and they would come together as a group as well. And they may not have the same interests as, these people over here, things like that. So, ethnic loyalties as well helped with that. And many of those people are the ones who were out of jobs once the oil field come through. So many native Texans took those oil field jobs, and immigrants were kind of pushed out.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. All right. Well, we thank y'all very much for coming, and we hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.